When Mary saw the for sale sign on her grandmother's lawn, she froze. Catherine, 84, with dementia, had no idea her home was being sold. The paperwork said she'd signed the transfer herself, but the signature looked wrong. The title company's fraud check caught it instantly. The notary was her cousin Brandon's friend. And that's when Mary realized. Her cousin had tried to steal their grandmother's home while she slept. Catherine had lived in that house for 40 years. It was paid off. It was supposed to be her safe place. Mary was her caregiver, and when Mary dug into the sale, she found a betrayal that went deeper than a forged signature. Mary pulled into the driveway at 4:30 that Tuesday afternoon. The sign hadn't been there when she left for her morning shift. She sat in her car, engine idling, staring at the words, "For sale," with a real estate logo at the bottom. Catherine had never mentioned selling. Catherine couldn't remember to turn off the stove half the time. She found her grandmother in the living room, curled into the corner of the sofa, the television blaring a game show she wasn't watching. Catherine's eyes were red. "There was a man here," she said, her voice small. "He wanted me to pack my things. He said the house doesn't belong to me anymore." Mary knelt beside her. "What man, Grandma?" Catherine shook her head. She couldn't remember his name, just that he was official, very insistent. Mary checked the front door. No damage. But a small metal lockbox now hung from the doorknob, the kind realtors use for key access. She hadn't put it there. Catherine Hadley was 84. She'd spent 40 years teaching ninth-grade English before retiring. She and her husband George bought this house in 1985 with a 30-year mortgage they paid off early. George died in 2012. In 2020, when Catherine started forgetting appointments and getting lost on the way home from the grocery store, Mary moved in. She was an only child, a nursing student, 28 then, drowning in student debt but raised to understand that family shows up. Catherine had two living relatives, Mary and Brandon. Brandon was Mary's cousin, Catherine's grandson through her late son. He lived an hour away, worked in commercial real estate, and visited exactly twice a year, Christmas Eve and Catherine's birthday, and only when he wanted something. The last time he'd come by, he'd spent 2 hours in the basement going through George's old tools. Catherine had been unsettled for days afterward, though she couldn't explain why. Mary called the number on the sign. The listing agent answered on the second ring, voice bright with commission. "Oh yes," she said, "we've been working with the seller's grandson. He provided a signed transfer document, notarized, everything in order. Very clean sale." Mary's grip tightened on the phone. "Signed by who?" The agent paused. "By the owner, Catherine Hadley. I have the document right here." Mary asked her to email a copy. She opened the attachment on her phone, zoomed in on the signature line. She'd watched her grandmother sign hundreds of things over the years. Catherine's handwriting had a distinct rhythm, a loop on the capital C that she'd been making the same way since she was 20. This signature was different. It was stiff, hesitant, the lines slightly jagged like someone had drawn it slowly, carefully, trying to copy something they'd only seen once. The notary stamp was from a mobile notary public named Kevin Merriweather. Mary searched the name. Kevin Merriweather's address was a shared office suite downtown. His social media was public. She scrolled back to 3 weeks earlier. There, tagged in his photos, was Brandon at a backyard barbecue. Kevin's caption, "Great catching up with my boy Brandon. Always scheming," heart emoji. Mary called the title company handling the sale. She was transferred to a fraud specialist named Diane. Mary explained the situation. Her grandmother has dementia, the signature is wrong, the notary is friends with the cousin. Diane listened. Then she said, "We take this extremely seriously. Title companies use signature comparison software and historical records to verify every document. We'll pull your grandmother's previously notarized files immediately." That process takes hours. Mary spent them at the kitchen table, sorting through Catherine's paperwork, looking for anything that might prove Brandon's fraud. She found a shoebox full of old tax returns, a folder of insurance policies, and then a thick manila envelope she'd never noticed before. It was labeled in her grandmother's neat handwriting, "Estate Planning Final Copy." The date on the envelope was 3 years ago. She pulled out the contents. Inside was a revocable living trust, signed and notarized by a different notary, one from Catherine's longtime law firm. The trust transferred ownership of the house into a protective trust structure, with Mary named as the successor trustee and sole beneficiary. If Catherine became incapacitated or passed away, the house went directly to Mary. Catherine had quietly ensured her granddaughter would always have a roof over her head. Mary stared at the document. The house wasn't just Catherine's to give away. It was already legally destined for Mary. Brandon's forged signature wasn't just an attempt to steal from their grandmother. It was an attempt to steal from her, and that changed everything. Mary didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, the trust document spread in front of her next to the forged transfer, and she made a list of every person who needed to see the truth. First call 7:16 the next morning, Diane at the title company. Mary scanned the trust pages and sent them over. Diane pulled Catherine's signature card from 3 years ago, the one she'd used to notarize the trust. She compared it side by side with the signature on Brandon's transfer. The notary block didn't match, but that wasn't the real alarm. The signature itself, the way the pen lifted, the angle of the loops, it was a textbook traceover. Someone had placed a genuine signature under a sheet of paper and attempted to recreate it in one continuous, painstaking motion. The pen pressure varied wrong. The starting stroke began exactly on the line rather than above it. A forensic document examiner would call it conclusive in 30 seconds. Diane froze the transaction at 9:02 in the morning. No sale could proceed with an active fraud investigation. She contacted the listing agent and instructed her to pull the sign and lockbox and to preserve all communications with Brandon. The agent was shaken. She'd been working with him for 3 weeks. She'd believed he had full authority. She'd even helped him stage the house with rented furniture while Catherine was at a medical appointment. Mary drove to the police station. She filed a report for elder financial exploitation and submitted copies of both the trust and the forged document, along with Brandon's Facebook messages to Kevin the notary, messages Mary had found through a mutual friend's page, where Brandon bragged about getting Grandma's house sorted. The detective assigned was a woman named Sergeant Reyes, who specialized in crimes against seniors. She listened to Mary's full account, nodded, and said, "You'd be surprised how often this happens, and how rarely victims have a trust already set up. Most families find out after the house is gone." By noon, the county's elder abuse hotline had an intake form on Catherine's case. The Adult Protective Services investigator called Mary for an interview. They were building a parallel file: vulnerable adult, documented cognitive decline, unauthorized property transfer, conflict of interest by a family member. That file would become part of the district attorney's charging package. Mary went home to Catherine. She found her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table, staring at an old photo album, pictures of George, pictures of Mary as a baby, pictures of a much younger Brandon with cake on his face at a birthday party. Catherine looked up and said, "Brandon was always so impatient. Even as a little boy, he'd grab his presents before anyone said go." That single sentence, spoken with the strange clarity dementia sometimes brings, told Mary that Catherine had always known what kind of person her grandson was, but Mary still didn't understand how deep it went. The title company's investigation unearthed more. Brandon had visited Catherine 3 months earlier with a document he called just some insurance forms. Catherine, trusting and confused, had signed a few pages without reading them. One of those signatures had been scanned and printed onto the transfer document. The forgery wasn't even freehand. It was a digital lift-in place on a blank signature line, then a notary who falsely swore he'd watched her sign. Kevin Merriweather, the notary, was interviewed by Detective Reyes 2 days later. At first he claimed Catherine was present. Then, faced with time-stamped credit card receipts showing him buying gas an hour away at the time of the alleged signing, he broke. He admitted Brandon had brought the document to him fully signed, that he'd been paid $300 to stamp it without asking questions, and that this wasn't the first time he'd helped Brandon expedite paperwork. Reyes charged him with notarial misconduct, a degree felony. The warrant for Brandon came on a Thursday morning. Mary was on her porch drinking coffee when a patrol car pulled up to Brandon's apartment across town. She got the call from Reyes an hour later. Brandon was in custody, charged with forgery, attempted grand theft, and elder exploitation. He'd been arrested at his office, his desk covered with loan applications he'd been trying to secure using the pending sale as collateral. If the house had closed, he'd have walked away with nearly $300,000, and Catherine would have been evicted into a Medicaid facility by the end of the month. But here's the thing about fraud. The people committing it usually have already dug themselves a hole deep enough that one crime is rarely their first. When Reyes searched Brandon's financial records, she found a pattern of small thefts dating back 2 years: checkbook thefts, credit card skimming, a home equity line of credit Catherine never knew about. The house wasn't his first target. It was his last desperate move before the bank came for everything he'd already stolen. And his desperation wasn't over yet. Brandon's arrest made the local news. Elder abuse cases rarely break past the police blotter, but this one had teeth. A family member, a forged deed, a dementia victim. The headline read, "Real estate agent accused of forging grandma's signature to sell her home." Mary's phone rang constantly. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles. A victim's advocate from the district attorney's office called to walk her through what came next. But the media attention did something else, too. It flushed out Brandon's other victims. A retired man named Harold Green, 72, called the detective. He'd hired Brandon to sell his house the year before. The sale had gone smoothly, but 6 months later Harold discovered his credit cards had been opened in his name without his knowledge, accounts with addresses he'd never lived at. He'd assumed identity theft from a stranger. Now he was putting it together. Brandon had his social security number from the real estate paperwork. Brandon had run a credit check on him. Then Brandon had used that data to open 3 credit lines totaling $40,000. Another victim came forward. A widow in her late 60s named Patricia had met Brandon at an elder care networking event. He'd offered to help her manage her late husband's estate. She'd signed a power of attorney. Within 8 months, he drained her savings account, sold her late husband's classic car, and opened a reverse mortgage on her home. Patricia never knew until the bank started calling. She'd been too ashamed to report it. When she saw Brandon's mugshot online, she finally called the police. Detective Reyes now had a pattern. Brandon wasn't a desperate man who made one terrible choice. He was a predator who had been targeting elderly homeowners for years, choosing victims who were isolated, grieving, or slipping mentally. He'd worked as a real estate agent specifically to access their most valuable assets. He carried blank notary forms in his car. He had a notebook with notes on dozens of potential leads, friends of Catherine's, parents of acquaintances, seniors he met at church. The notebook was titled in his handwriting, Prospects. Mary learned about the notebook from Reyes. She sat in the detective's office while Reyes read excerpts from it. Each entry listed a name, an age, a vulnerability. Anne, 79, no children, husband passed 2019. Robert, 81, early memory loss, owns 2 properties. Mary felt sick. This was her cousin. She'd grown up with him, shared Thanksgiving dinners with him, watched him open Christmas presents beside her. What she'd thought was a family betrayal was actually the exposure of a serial predator who wore a suit and a smile. Then came the worst revelation. Reyes asked if Mary had known that Catherine's home had been listed for sale once before, 6 months earlier, but the deal had fallen through. Mary hadn't known. Catherine had never mentioned it. Reyes showed her the cancelled listing. Brandon had used a different real estate agent that time, someone who asked too many questions about Catherine's capacity. When the agent requested a documented letter of competency from Catherine's doctor, Brandon withdrew the listing and waited. He'd been circling the house for over 6 months, degrading gradually from smooth operator to reckless forger, because his other schemes were beginning to collapse, and he needed cash fast. That weekend, Mary went through every piece of mail that arrived at the house with a magnifying glass. She found a collection letter addressed to Catherine from a credit union she'd never done business with. She called. The loan had been taken out 6 months ago, secured against the house, a home equity line of credit for $25,000. The loan officer told her that a man named Brandon Hadley had brought Catherine in personally, and she'd signed the papers. Mary asked for the date of the signing. It was a day Catherine had been at a neurology appointment with Mary, an hour in the wrong direction. The loan officer pulled the surveillance footage. The woman in the video was not Catherine. She was roughly the same age, but her hair was a different color, and she wore glasses. Brandon had paid a stranger to pose as his grandmother. Sergeant Reyes added identity theft and bank fraud to the charges. The total financial damage across all known victims exceeded $200,000. If Brandon hadn't gotten impatient with the house sale, he might have gone on indefinitely. The fraud check by the title company had been the tripwire that unraveled a multi-year scheme. But Mary wasn't celebrating. She was thinking about her grandmother, sitting in that house, confused and frightened by a stranger telling her to pack her things. And she was thinking about how close it had come. If Diane hadn't pulled those signatures that morning, if Mary hadn't found the trust in the shoebox, if Catherine hadn't had the clarity years earlier to set up legal protections, the house would be gone by now. Catherine would be in a facility, disoriented, asking for a home that no longer existed. The protective trust Catherine had signed 3 years before wasn't just paperwork. It was a grandmother's last lucid gift to her granddaughter, a shield built while her mind was still whole enough to know that someone might try to take everything. And that gift, buried in a closet in a manila envelope, had just saved both their lives. Brandon's trial began 8 months later. He faced 14 charges: forgery, notarial fraud, elder exploitation, identity theft, bank fraud, and conspiracy. The district attorney brought in Diane from the title company as their star witness. She walked the jury through the signature comparison process, showing the traced loops, the odd pen pressure, the telltale sign of a hand trying too hard to copy something it had never truly signed. She testified that without her company's verification protocol, the sale would have closed in 3 days. The house would have transferred, and Catherine Hadley would have been served an eviction notice from a home she didn't know she'd sold. Kevin Merriweather, the notary, testified as part of a plea deal. He admitted to stamping over 40 documents for Brandon without ever verifying the signers' identities. He'd been paid per signature, cash in hand, over the course of 4 years. He also identified the woman who had posed as Catherine for the home equity line of credit, Brandon's mother, Linda Hadley. She had been estranged from the family for a decade, living 2 states away. Brandon had flown her in for the loan signing, coached her on what to say, and paid her $500. Linda was also arrested and charged. She took a plea deal, too, facing 18 months. Harold Green and Patricia Mullins, the other victims, gave impact statements. Harold, still paying off the credit card debt Brandon had opened in his name, told the court he'd trusted Brandon with his largest asset and received a parasite in return. Patricia, her voice shaking, described the shame of losing her husband's possessions and the terror of watching her home equity vanish. The prosecution read excerpts from Brandon's notebook aloud. The jury saw the word prospects written in his handwriting, underlined twice. They convicted him on all counts after 4 hours of deliberation. The judge sentenced Brandon to 14 years in state prison, with a restitution order totaling $243,000. No one expected to see a cent. Brandon's assets were seized, but he'd spent faster than he'd stolen. The house on Catherine Street, the one he'd tried to sell, was the one he'd never get to touch. Catherine didn't attend the trial. Mary didn't want her to relive it, but she did tell her grandmother the outcome on a quiet afternoon in the living room with the same photo album open between them. Catherine listened, her eyes narrowing slightly, then she said, "I remember I told you once he'd grab his presents before anyone said go." She patted Mary's hand. "The trust was my gift to you, sweetheart. He never asked for it, so he never found it." That trust, signed 3 years before Catherine's diagnosis, had been filed quietly, with no fanfare, no announcement. It listed Mary as the sole successor trustee, the house to transfer directly to her without probate if Catherine could no longer manage her affairs. Catherine's lawyer told Mary later that her grandmother had come in with a specific request. "I need to protect my home from my grandson. I can't explain why I know, but I know." That was the year Brandon had started calling more often, asking about the house, about its value, about whether Catherine had thought about downsizing. She had thought about it, and then she'd thought about who her grandson really was. Within a month, the trust was in place. Mary asked the lawyer, did she know he'd tried to forge something? The lawyer shook his head. She didn't know the method, she just knew the instinct. The house is still there. The stone walkway, the oak tree in the front yard, the kitchen where Mary sat with 2 documents spread before her on that first terrible night. Catherine still lives in it, with Mary as her caregiver. A home health aide comes 3 days a week. The locks were changed, a security camera installed, the title permanently cleared of any claim Brandon might have tried to resurrect. The trust now holds the deed, and Mary is both trustee and daughter, granddaughter and guardian. Here's what almost no one knows. A week before the trial ended, Mary found a letter in the attic. It was in a box with George's old things, unsealed, with Catherine's handwriting on the envelope. It was dated 6 months before her diagnosis. Inside was a single page addressed to Mary. It read, "If you're reading this, we've already had the hard conversation. I'm not myself anymore. Remember that Brandon wants the house. I've told my lawyer, I've signed papers. You'll know where they are when you need them, but if he does something dishonest, don't be surprised. He's been looking at this house like it's his since he was 12. I love you, stay strong." Catherine had never given her the letter. Maybe she forgot she wrote it. Maybe she thought the trust was enough. But the note proved something that Mary hadn't allowed herself to believe. Her grandmother, even as her memory began to fade, had been fighting back. She had been watching and waiting, and she had set the trap that Brandon walked right into. The trust wasn't just a legal document. It was the final lesson of a 40-year teacher to her one student, delivered from a mind that knew it was losing itself but refused to lose what mattered most. Catherine Hadley's trust wasn't a legal technicality. It was a grandmother's last clear thought, poured onto paper before the fog rolled in. Because she had the courage to see her grandson for who he was, she built a wall he couldn't forge his way through. The title company's fraud check caught the signature, yes, but the trust was what made the house untouchable in the first place. Elder financial exploitation steals an estimated $3 billion a year from American seniors. Most of it is committed by family members. Most of it goes unreported. And in a staggering number of cases, the victim had no trust, no guardian, and no one watching. Catherine was the exception because she planned ahead while she still could. The title company didn't just save a house. They exposed a serial predator. A single signature comparison by a diligent fraud specialist cascaded into 14 criminal charges and freed multiple victims from years of silent suffering. That's the power of one professional who refuses to look away. If this story hit something in you, please like and subscribe. Drop your location and local time in the comments. I read them all, and knowing where you're listening from matters to me. This is a reminder that sometimes the most powerful protection isn't a locked door or a security camera. It's a piece of paper, signed with a steady hand, by someone who loved you enough to see the future before it arrived.